The billionaire stepped out of his Rolls-Royce. What he saw left him speechless. Stepped out of his Rolls-Royce. What he saw left him speechless. Hey, stop scrolling for a second. What you're about to hear happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, in front of an iron gate, under a fading orange sky. A woman was crying. A man was staring. And a wife was pointing her finger like she was casting someone out of her own world. Nobody in that driveway knew that this single moment, this one cruel, careless moment, was about to unravel a secret that had been buried for 23 years. Stay with me. This gets unbelievable. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. I really do read every single one. Today's story is one of those heartbreaking, heart-mending stories about pride, shame, and the truth that always finds its way home, no matter how deep you bury it. I promise you, you will not see this twist coming. Let's get into it. It started like every other day at the Whitfield estate. Rosa Delgado had worked as a housemaid for the Whitfield family for almost 11 years. She was 52 years old, with tired hands and a back that ached every morning before she even got out of bed. She lived in a small apartment above a laundromat in Newark, New Jersey, and every single day she took 2 buses and walked half a mile just to reach the towering iron gates of the Whitfield mansion in Alpine, New Jersey, one of the wealthiest zip codes in America. Rosa wasn't just an employee. To the family, or at least to the old family, she had once been something closer to a member of the household. She had helped raise the Whitfield children when their mother, Diane, was too busy with charity galas and country club luncheons to tuck them in at night. She had bandaged scraped knees, stayed up during fevers, and quietly slipped grocery money into the hands of the kitchen staff when times were tight. But things had changed. Old Mr. Whitfield, the family patriarch who had treated Rosa with dignity and warmth, had passed away 3 years earlier. His son, Nathaniel Whitfield, now ran the family's real estate empire, and Nathaniel's wife, Vanessa, ran the household. Ran it, some staff whispered, like a prison warden. Vanessa Whitfield was 38, poised, polished, and utterly convinced that her husband's inherited wealth was somehow a personal accomplishment. She wore her contempt for the help like perfume, subtle to her friends, suffocating to everyone else. That evening, Rosa was hauling an old wooden cart down the long cobblestone driveway. Inside it was everything she owned at the estate: a small trunk of spare uniforms, a framed photo of her late husband, a rosary that had belonged to her mother, and a few kitchen tools she'd brought from home because the estate's equipment was, in her words, too fancy to actually cook with. She had been fired. Not laid off. Not let go with severance. Fired, publicly, coldly, in front of the entire household staff, because a $200 antique vase had gone missing from the East Wing 3 days earlier. Rosa hadn't taken it. She would never. But Vanessa didn't care about proof. She cared about control. And firing the woman who had been there longer than she had, the woman whose loyalty the staff still whispered about with respect, was Vanessa's way of reminding everyone exactly who was in charge now. As Rosa pulled her cart down the driveway toward the gate, tears streaming down her face, she heard the crunch of tires on gravel behind her. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up, its engine humming low and expensive. The driver's door opened. Nathaniel Whitfield stepped out. He hadn't been home when Vanessa fired Rosa. He'd been in the city, closing a deal that would add another $40 million to the family portfolio. He didn't yet know what his wife had done. But the moment he saw Rosa, bent over that old wooden cart, sobbing, dragging her whole life away in a box, something in his chest went cold. "Rosa," he said, his voice catching. "What is this? What's going on?" Before Rosa could answer, Vanessa came storming out from the front steps of the mansion, heels clicking against the marble like gunfire. "She's leaving," Vanessa said sharply, pointing a manicured finger toward Rosa as if she were pointing at a stray dog that had wandered onto the lawn. She's a thief, Nathaniel. Caught her. I don't care how long she's worked here. She is never setting foot on this property again. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He looked at Rosa, really looked at her, and for one brief second something flickered behind his eyes. Something like memory. Something like recognition of a debt he didn't even know he owed. Rosa didn't steal anything, he said quietly. She would never. How would you know? Vanessa snapped. You're never even here. The sun was dipping low behind the mansion's rooftop, painting the whole driveway in gold and shadow. Rosa stood frozen between the two of them, humiliated, exhausted, wondering if this was how 11 years of loyalty were supposed to end. With a cart, a cold gate, and a woman pointing her finger like she was erasing a person's whole existence. But what none of them knew, what nobody standing in that driveway that evening could have possibly imagined, was that the missing vase wasn't the real story here at all. The real story had been hidden for 23 years. And it was about to come out. Nathaniel didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study long after Vanessa had gone to bed, the fireplace crackling weakly, a glass of untouched scotch sweating on the side table. He kept replaying the image of Rosa in the driveway. That cart, those tears, the way she hadn't even tried to defend herself, as if she'd expected this kind of cruelty all along. Something about her silence bothered him more than if she had screamed and fought. He thought back to his childhood. Rosa had been there for almost every important moment. She'd taught him how to tie his shoes when his own mother was too busy to be bothered. She'd sat with him during thunderstorms when he was terrified of the lightning. She'd covered for him more than once when he'd snuck out as a teenager, quietly leaving his window unlocked and never breathing a word to his father. And there was one memory, foggy, distant, something he'd buried so deep he almost convinced himself he'd dreamed it, of Rosa holding him as a baby, singing a lullaby in Spanish, her voice trembling with something that felt less like a nanny's affection and more like a mother's grief. He shook the thought away. Didn't make sense. He was born to Diane and Robert Whitfield. There were photos. There were hospital records. There was a whole life built on that fact. Wasn't there? The next morning, Nathaniel drove to Newark himself. No driver, no assistant, just him behind the wheel of his own car for the first time in years. He found Rosa's small apartment above the laundromat, the paint peeling off the wooden door, a single dim light glowing behind the curtain. She opened the door slowly, surprised to see him standing there. "Mr. Whitfield," she said softly. "You shouldn't be here." "I need to ask you something," Nathaniel said, his voice shaking slightly. "And I need you to tell me the truth. All of it." Rosa's face went pale. She stepped back, letting him inside, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. She simply stared at the floor, her hands trembling in her lap as she sat down on the edge of an old couch. 23 years, she finally whispered. "I've kept this for 23 years. Nathaniel felt his pulse pounding in his ears. Kept what, Rosa? Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of humiliation. They were tears of a burden finally being set down after decades of carrying it alone. "I'm not your nanny, Nathaniel," she said. "I never was, not really. I was hired to be your nanny because it was the only way your parents could keep me close without anyone asking questions." "What questions?" he asked, though some part of him, some old, quiet part, already knew the answer was going to change everything. Rosa reached into an old cigar box on the side table, the kind with faded gold trim and a broken clasp. Her fingers shook as she opened it and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "Your mother, Diane, she couldn't have children," Rosa said. "There were complications. Years of trying. Years of heartbreak. And when I got pregnant, your father made an arrangement with me. Private one. No lawyers. No agencies. Just an agreement between two families. One desperate for a child and one desperate for money to survive." Nathaniel's whole body went numb. "Rosa, what are you saying?" She unfolded the paper with trembling hands and placed it gently into his. It was a birth certificate. Not the one he'd grown up seeing in the family safe. A different one. Older. Real. His birth mother's name was written clearly at the top. Rosa Delgado. For a long moment, Nathaniel couldn't speak. He simply stared at the paper in his hands, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were reading. "This isn't real," he whispered. "This can't be real." "It's real," Rosa said quietly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was 19 years old, working 2 jobs, barely surviving. Your father found me through a private adoption broker, the kind that operates in the shadows, away from courts and paperwork that could ever trace back to a wealthy family's name. He offered me more money than I'd ever seen in my life. Enough to take care of my mother's medical bills. Enough to give my future children, the ones I hope to have someday, a fighting chance. But that's not the worst part," she continued, her voice breaking. "The worst part is what he asked of me afterward. He said Diane couldn't bear the thought of a stranger raising her son. So he offered me a job. As your nanny. So I could watch you grow up. But never ever tell you the truth. Never claim you. Never let you know." Nathaniel felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. 23 years of memories rearranged themselves in his mind. Every lullaby, every late night, every quiet act of love that had felt just slightly different from ordinary hired affection. It all made sense now. It all hurt in a way he didn't have words for. "You've been protecting a secret that let them treat you like nothing," he said, his voice cracking. "For my whole life." "I made a promise," Rosa said. "And whatever I felt, whatever it cost me, kept it. Because I loved you too much to break the life your parents built for you. Even when it meant watching you call another woman mom. Even when it meant swallowing my pride every single day just to stay close enough to see you grow." Nathaniel sat there in stunned silence, tears finally breaking free and rolling down his face. A grown man, one of the wealthiest real estate developers on the East Coast, sitting in a small Newark apartment above a laundromat, discovering that the woman his own wife had just thrown out onto the street like garbage was, in fact, his biological mother. "Why now?" he finally asked. "Why tell me now, after all these years of silence?" Rosa looked at him, her eyes filled with a strange, aching relief. "Because your wife looked at me yesterday like I was worthless," she said. "Like I was nothing. And for the first time in 23 years I realized. I don't want to die carrying a secret that lets people believe that about me. I don't want you to spend your whole life thinking I was just the help. You deserve to know where you truly come from. Even if it changes everything." Nathaniel reached out and, for the first time in his adult life, took his birth mother's hand. "It does change everything," he said softly. "But not in the way you think." The days that followed were some of the hardest and most transformative of Nathaniel's life. He confronted his adoptive mother, Diane, who, through tears of her own, confirmed every word Rosa had said. She admitted that keeping Rosa close as a nanny had been her idea, born out of guilt she never knew how to properly resolve. She had loved Nathaniel fiercely as her own son, and in some twisted, complicated way, keeping Rosa near had felt like honoring the woman who made that motherhood possible, even while denying Rosa the recognition she deserved. "I was scared," Diane admitted, sitting across from her son in the same study where he'd spent that sleepless night. "Scared that if people knew the truth, they'd see you differently. See our family differently. I told myself I was protecting you. But really, I think I was protecting myself." Nathaniel didn't respond right away. There was too much to process. Grief for the childhood he thought he understood, anger at the secrecy, and a strange, complicated gratitude toward 2 women who, in their own broken ways, had both loved him. But there was still Vanessa. When Nathaniel told his wife the truth, her reaction wasn't shame. It wasn't remorse. It was defensive fury. "So what?" she snapped. "That doesn't change anything." She's still the help. Blood or not, she works for this family. She is this family, Nathaniel said. His voice steady in a way it had never been with Vanessa before. She's my mother. And you had her dragging a cart down our driveway like she was nothing, over a vase you never even bothered to actually investigate. You're being ridiculous, Vanessa said, crossing her arms. This is exactly why staff and family should never mix. Emotions get involved. Boundaries disappear. Nathaniel stared at his wife for a long moment, seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time in years. Polish. The pride. The complete absence of empathy for anyone she considered beneath her. You know what the real twist here is, Vanessa, he said quietly. The vase wasn't even missing. Found it this morning. In the East Wing storage closet. Exactly where the new housekeeper had moved it during cleaning last week. Rosa never touched it. Vanessa's face went pale. You fired an innocent woman, Nathaniel continued, who happens to be my birth mother, over a mistake that was never even hers. And you didn't even bother to check the facts first. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. The silence that followed said everything. News like this doesn't stay quiet in circles like the Whitfields. Within weeks, whispers began circulating through the country clubs and charity boards of northern New Jersey. Nathaniel Whitfield, heir to one of the largest real estate empires on the East Coast, had discovered his childhood nanny was, in fact, his biological mother. And he wasn't hiding from it. He wasn't ashamed. If anything, he was making sure the world knew. He invited Rosa to move out of her small apartment above the laundromat. Not into a guest house, not into staff quarters. Into the main house, into a suite that had once belonged to his late grandmother. Rosa resisted at first, uncomfortable with the sudden shift from servant to family matriarch. I don't need luxury, Nathaniel, she told him one evening as they sat together on the mansion's back terrace, watching the sun dip behind the tree line. I just needed to stop being invisible. You were never invisible to me, Nathaniel said. I just didn't know how to see you clearly. Not until I almost lost the chance to. Word of the family drama eventually made its way to a local paper, then a regional news outlet, and finally, inevitably, given the size of the Whitfield family's public profile, a national morning show reached out requesting an interview. Nathaniel initially declined. This wasn't a story for cameras, he said. It was a story about a mother and son finding their way back to each other after a lifetime of forced distance. But Rosa, surprisingly, was the one who encouraged him to reconsider. Maybe, she said, if people hear our story, it helps someone else find the courage to tell their truth too. Maybe some other mother out there, or some other child, gets to stop hiding. So they said yes. Meanwhile, Vanessa's world was quietly unraveling. As the story spread, so did scrutiny of her behavior. How she had treated household staff over the years, how she had let an innocent woman be publicly humiliated over an assumption rather than an investigation. Friends who once admired her polished, commanding presence began keeping a careful distance. Nobody wanted to be associated with the woman who had thrown her husband's mother out onto the street like trash, live and in full view of half the household. Nathaniel filed for divorce 2 months later. It wasn't just about the vase, or the driveway, or even Rosa. It was about finally seeing, with total clarity, the difference between the life he had been performing and the life he actually wanted to build. One rooted in honesty, humility, and the people who had shown him real love long before his name ever meant anything on a business card. The morning show interview aired on a quiet Sunday in early autumn. Rosa sat beside Nathaniel on a soft studio couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a simple blue dress instead of the maid's uniform she'd worn for over a decade. She looked nervous, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes, the strength of a woman who had spent 23 years swallowing her truth and was finally allowed to speak it out loud. I want people to understand something, Rosa said, her voice steady despite the bright studio lights. I don't regret the choice I made all those years ago. I got to watch my son grow into an incredible man, even if I couldn't claim him as mine. But I do regret staying silent about my own worth. I let people believe I was just the help for so long that I almost started believing it myself." The host, visibly moved, asked Nathaniel what this discovery had taught him. "That wealth doesn't determine character," he said, glancing at his mother beside him. "I grew up believing certain people mattered more because of what they had. Titles, money, status. But the person who loved me the most unconditionally, the person who sacrificed the most for my happiness, was standing in my own kitchen the whole time, wearing an apron, and I almost let her walk away because I was too blind to see what was right in front of me." The clip went viral within hours. Millions of viewers across the country shared it, commented on it, cried over it. People who had grown up in blended families, adoptive families, families held together by secrets and sacrifice. They saw themselves in Rosa's story. They saw the housekeepers, nannies, and caretakers in their own lives who had given more love than blood relatives ever had. And they finally understood the quiet dignity behind so much invisible labor. But amid the outpouring of support, there was one more twist still waiting. A woman named Carol Jennings reached out to the show's producers, claiming she had information relevant to the story. She was invited to speak with Nathaniel privately, off camera, before any further coverage aired. Carol had worked at the same private adoption broker Rosa had used all those years ago, the same one Nathaniel's father had quietly arranged the adoption through. And she had something Rosa herself had never known. There had been a second party involved in the original arrangement. Second child. Nathaniel sat across from Carol Jennings in a quiet hotel conference room, his heart pounding as she opened an old manila folder, faded and creased with age. 23 years ago, Carol began, your father didn't just arrange one adoption. Rosa was pregnant with twins. The room seemed to tilt beneath Nathaniel. Twins, he repeated, barely able to get the word out. Your parents could only afford, or perhaps only wanted, to take in one child, Carol continued gently. The other baby, a girl, was placed with a different family through the same broker. A family in Ohio, if my old records are accurate. I don't know what happened to her after that. The broker's business shut down not long after, and most records were sealed or destroyed. Nathaniel drove straight to Rosa's suite that evening, the folder trembling in his hands. Rosa, he said, sitting down beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did you have twins? Rosa's face went white. She hadn't spoken those words out loud in over 2 decades. How did you? She started, then stopped, tears filling her eyes instantly. Yes, there were 2 of you, boy and a girl. Your father. He said the arrangement could only accommodate 1 child. I never even got to see her properly before they took her. I don't know where she went. I've spent 23 years wondering, praying, hoping she was happy wherever she ended up. Nathaniel placed the folder gently in her lap. I think I might be able to help you find her, he said. Over the following weeks, Nathaniel hired the best private investigators money could buy. Not for himself, not for the business, but for his mother. For the sister he never knew he had. Every lead, every dead end, every fragment of a decades-old paper trail was chased down with a determination that surprised even Rosa. And then, finally, a name surfaced. Emily Carter, 23 years old, living in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. Raised by adoptive parents who, according to records, had passed away several years earlier in a car accident. She had grown up without knowing anything about her biological family. No name, no history, nothing but a sealed file and a lifetime of quiet questions about where she truly came from. Rosa broke down in tears when she saw the photo the investigator had found. A young woman with the same warm brown eyes, the same soft smile Rosa saw in the mirror every single day. That's her, Rosa whispered. That's my daughter. Reaching out to Emily wasn't simple. There were legal considerations, emotional risks, and the very real possibility that after 23 years of silence, she might not want anything to do with the family that had, in some sense, left her behind before she'd even taken her first breath. Nathaniel insisted on writing the first letter himself, rather than sending an investigator or a lawyer. He wanted it to feel human. He wanted it to feel true. He wrote about growing up with two mothers and never knowing it, one who raised him publicly, and one who loved him quietly from the shadows. He wrote about the driveway, the cart, the vase, and the 23 years of silence that had finally cracked open. And he wrote, gently, that there was a woman named Rosa Delgado who had never stopped wondering about the daughter she'd never gotten to hold. Weeks passed without a response. Rosa tried to prepare herself for disappointment, telling herself that some doors, once closed, were meant to stay closed. She busied herself helping in the estate's garden, something she'd always found peaceful, trying not to let hope consume her entirely. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, a car pulled up outside the Whitfield estate. Not a Rolls-Royce, not anything fancy, just a modest used sedan with Ohio plates. Rosa was in the garden when she heard the gate creak open. She turned around, gardening gloves still on her hands, dirt smudged across her cheek, and saw a young woman standing at the edge of the driveway, hesitant, nervous, clutching an old, worn photograph in her hand. "Are you Rosa?" the young woman asked, her voice trembling. Rosa dropped her gloves in the dirt and walked toward her slowly, tears already streaming down her face. "Emily," she whispered, though nobody had told her the name out loud in that exact moment. She simply knew. A mother's heart, even after 23 years of separation, somehow always knows. They stood there in the rain, two strangers who were not strangers at all, holding each other for the very first time. Nathaniel watched from the porch, tears in his own eyes, thinking about how just weeks earlier, this same driveway had been the site of his mother's public humiliation, a moment of cruelty that had somehow, impossibly, become the catalyst for the most beautiful reunion he had ever witnessed. The months that followed transformed the Whitfield estate in ways nobody could have predicted. Emily moved to New Jersey, slowly building a relationship with the mother she'd never known and the brother she never knew existed. She was quiet at first, cautious, still processing a lifetime of unanswered questions. But little by little, surrounded by people who wanted nothing more than to make up for lost time, she began to open up. Rosa, for the first time in over 2 decades, had both of her children under one roof. She would often sit on the terrace in the evenings, watching Nathaniel and Emily talk and laugh together, and feel a kind of peace she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. Nathaniel, meanwhile, used his platform and resources to do something meaningful with the pain his family had endured. He established a foundation dedicated to supporting domestic workers, nannies, and caregivers, people who often gave everything to the families they served while receiving little recognition or protection in return. He funded legal aid for household workers facing unjust termination, established healthcare stipends for long-term domestic staff, and created scholarship funds for their children. He named the foundation after his mother, the Rosa Delgado Foundation for Dignity in Domestic Work. At the foundation's launch event, held not in some sterile corporate ballroom but in the very garden where Rosa had spent countless quiet mornings tending flowers, Nathaniel stood at the podium and looked out at a crowd of former household staff, community members, and reporters who had followed the story from the very beginning. "Almost a year ago," he said, "my mother was pushed out of this house's driveway, humiliated, disrespected, treated like she didn't matter. I almost let that happen without ever knowing the truth of who she really was to me. But here's what I've learned since then. Worth was never about a title, a paycheck, or a last name. My mother's worth was never in question. My blindness was." He looked over at Rosa, sitting in the front row with Emily beside her, both women wiping away tears. "She gave up everything so I could have a chance at a good life," he continued. "And she never once asked for anything in return, not even recognition. I think that's the truest definition of love I've ever witnessed. As for Vanessa, life took a very different turn. The divorce was finalized quietly, without the drama or spectacle many had expected. She kept her share of the settlement, moved out of state, and largely disappeared from the social circles she once dominated. Some said she never fully understood what she'd done wrong, that in her mind she'd simply been protecting her household from what she perceived as disorder. Others said the public fallout, the loss of friends, and the erosion of her once untouchable reputation had humbled her in ways money never could. Either way, her story became a quiet cautionary tale whispered in wealthy circles for years to come. A reminder that cruelty, especially toward those with less power, has a way of eventually finding its way back to the person who dispensed it. Rosa, meanwhile, found something she never expected to have at this stage of her life: peace, family, and recognition. She still gardened every morning, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She still cooked in the kitchen sometimes, not as staff, but as a mother who simply loved feeding the people she cared about. The difference now was that everyone in that house understood, deeply, fully, exactly who she was and what she meant to this family. Emily eventually enrolled in nursing school, funded quietly by her newfound family, determined to build a life defined by purpose rather than circumstance. She and Rosa spent countless evenings on that same terrace, filling in 23 years of missing history, laughing over small discovered similarities, crying over lost time neither could ever fully get back. And Nathaniel, the man who once stepped out of a Rolls-Royce and witnessed a stranger's cruelty toward a woman he barely understood, became someone entirely different. Someone who understood, in the deepest way possible, that true wealth was never about mansions, cars, or inherited fortunes. It was about the people who loved you before you ever had anything to offer them in return. So here's what I want to leave you with today. In life, we often judge people by their job titles, their bank accounts, or the uniforms they wear. But you never truly know who someone is, what they've sacrificed, or what quiet, invisible love they've carried for you until you take the time to really see them. Be kind to the people around you. The ones who serve you coffee, clean your homes, care for your children, or quietly show up every single day without asking for recognition. You never know whose story you're standing in the middle of. If this story touched your heart even a little bit, please hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you're new here because we share stories just like this one every single week. Stories about love, truth, and the quiet strength of people who are so often overlooked. And if you know someone who needs a reminder today that kindness always matters, please share this with them. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.